We're going to go over the Starter Control tab. This functionality is pre-configured on the vehicles that have it already, that we may have applications for. You can, however, add it to a vehicle that doesn't already have it, as long as the computer has control over the starter relay. So that would have to be wired in. But this is just going to be how you set up these options and kind of what you're looking for. So auto crank enabled, obviously, you're going to enable that if you want to use it. The input delay, some firmwares have this, some firmwares don't. This is dependent upon when you first hit the power button. If that's the same command coming into the ECU as the one that's going to crank the starter, we're going to have a delay on that, so that if you hit the button just to power it up, it doesn't try to run the crank. So if you're pushing the starter, it starts spinning the starter automatically. Your starter request polarity, this is the same as all the other polarities throughout the software. You can invert that functionality if it's working backwards. If it's working normal, you leave it on normal. Most of the time, it's going to be you leave it on normal. Okay. CAN starter input. That's just if you're using CAN for your crank signal input, yes or no. Max engine speed for starter. You want to set this number just out of its normal cranking speed. Like let's say, for example, the engine spins over to 150 RPM. I usually set that to like 300 or so. It's got hysteresis in it. So when the engine fires and goes above that, and if it were to drop down, you were to idle it that low, that doesn't mean it's going to re-engage the starter. You have to be physically cranking it or within the cranking time. If you set that too low, the engine may want to try and fire and not finish starting because it shut the starter off. So just kind of be aware of that functionality and how that works. Maximum crank retries. If you hit the button and the car doesn't fire, and it's allotted amount of time, it's going to pause to allow the starter cool down, and then it's going to re-engage the starter and spin it again up to this many tries before it fires. So let's say, for example, the vehicle's out of gas. It'll do 3 full crank retries before it just stops trying again. Okay. Obviously, if you turn the ignition off, it will stop doing that. So if you notice a problem before it completes its cycle, just turn the ignition off just like a regular car. Okay. Max starter request time without RPM. Basically, if you hit a starter request, an auto crank function, and it doesn't see crank input within 5 seconds in this particular setting, it's just going to disable the starter output because it's going to assume something's wrong, either with the starter or with the cam and crank inputs. Starter control time, or starter cranking time out, it's going to crank for 8 seconds before it stops and then retries. This is a pretty long time. I usually run that for maybe 3 seconds. But set it to whatever you want there. Time between starter retries is 2 seconds, so it's going to pause for 2 seconds and then it's going to restart again. Running through the auto crank procedure. Start switch analog input. This is just which analog input you're having your start request come in if you're not using CAN. Auto crank switch polarity. Again, not all of these firmwares have this, but the ones that do, it's going to be just like the other ones, either normal or inverted. Auto crank switch ADC switch point. That's just like all our other ADC inputs. You're going to want to look at the ADC count when you hit the key for the request, see what that switches to, and set that number somewhere in the middle between when you're not on the switch and when you are on the switch. This will tell you if you've got a starter fault active. Starter enable, that's going to go from a 0 to a 1 if your starter enable request is there. If you got a command pending, or if you're going into auto crank mode, this will change state and it'll tell you which one you're in. Park neutral, that's just going to tell you if you're in park neutral to allow the cranking to work. So if you're wired to an automatic and this thinks you're in gear, the auto crank's not going to work. Two-step position, that's just for verification that you do actually have the two-step pushed in on a clutch car, so that it'll allow the starter to engage just like a normal stock car. And of course this gives you the text that tells you need to be aware of those things. We also have added functionality to disable all the injectors while doing this, or disable all coils, so you can test it, make sure you have it set up right before it tries to fire. And then once you've got everything working right, you can re-enable those